Welcome back. I hope you all are having a good new year so far. It's been a few weeks, but we finally have another episode. Before I talk about that, though, let's talk about sub and podcast business. So, we are we're a little over halfway through our fundraising goal so that we can upgrade the SoundCloud account. We are at $70 and we need about 150 in order to upgrade the account completely and make it more accessible for MP3 download and the like. So if you haven't contributed already, please follow the link in the video or in the sub post and help out there. If everyone can do $10 each, that can really add up and make a difference here, especially since we've gotten so much already, and thanks to those who have contributed so far. As for today's content, today we have BJ Campbell on. Some of you might be familiar with him. He, like me, is a writer for Medium and has had some interesting observations about various political and cultural issues that he often does from a mathematical point of view or just from a direction that is usually not taken, with things being split between the left and the right and being treated as black and white. And he is a very insightful person, and this ended up being, I think, one of our better episodes so far. So I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did. And with that, I give you BJ Campbell. All right, BJ, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I thought I normally let the guests do a bit of an introduction here, but I think you and I have a little bit more of an acquaintanceship before this, so I figure I'll just go ahead and say my bit on that, and then you can say more about yourself. But
I'll tell you where you're wrong.
Right, so my first time I took notice of you was when I saw your article on it was about, if I remember correctly, Dungeons and Dragons and IQ being compared to the intelligence-based stat in D&D.
That was a wild one. That hadn't got a whole lot of traffic. That's actually on a different blog than mine right now.
Yeah, that's on the Cause Girl publication.
That's correct. It's on Marjorie's.
Yeah, in fact, I liked it so much that I actually took an interest in Cause Girl, and I've written some stuff for them since then. I saw your article shared, if I remember correctly, in R. Sam Harris, and it got downvoted to death because it talked about IQ.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, the Sam Harris Reddit it's curious. It's like I couldn't figure out what's going on with it for a long time, and it took me some kind of external education to get it. I think that what's going on there is an artifact of the kind of explosion of the new atheism movement, right? I mean, you had a lot of people that gravitated toward Sam because he was kind of on this, religion is a mind virus thing, right? And so that plays really well with, I guess, maybe two factions. You've got one faction that's really inherently skeptical about everything, and then you've got the other faction who are kind of more social justice-y that just are like, yeah, we don't like Christianity, right? Or whatever, or caused all these problems, and so we want to fight it. But those two factions don't get along, right? So when you had the new atheism thing and they were gathering up for conferences and this and that, you had some people that were like, we need to be skeptical about everything, and therefore we're also skeptical about the social justice program. This is before, I think, the social justice program truly started to unravel in the way that it's unraveling now. Right. Some of like the proto SJWs were fans of Sam Harris. Right, exactly. And so they kind of split off and did their thing that they called, I believe it's called Atheism Plus. And I have not educated myself as well as I should on that whole breakup because I was not around for that. And, I've always kind of been skeptical of, I guess, atheism in some ways. And I've always been kind of frustrated a little bit with Sam about his take on a lot of that because I think that, I don't consider myself to be religious, very pro-religion. Sam comes from a place where he's like, well, we don't need a religion because I was able to establish all of my value making structures by doing DMT in a canoe in Nepal, and I'm just like, dude, I don't think that's scalable. I mean, religion serves a purpose, and the purpose is important. It's to convey indoctrinations that make society work. and then we can have an argument about whether the indoctrinations being conveyed are effective now or whether they used to be effective or whatnot. But I mean, the proof is in the pudding that we got what, 5 some odd major religions in the world right now, and then a bunch of small ones, but they are all kind of preaching the same thing. And
yeah, and I think you make a good point there. I mean, I think I'll just highlight one of the words you just said, which is scalable. That's one of the things I liked about the content you've produced on Medium, for example, is because you really try to look at things from a mathematical and analytical perspective. And often that's really the most practical way to look at something. Like if you want to look at something in terms of developing a solution to it, understanding it in a very mathematical and quantifiable sense is a good way to do it and develop actionable solutions. And so that's what I thought was good. I mean, and that's like a recurring theme in a lot of your stuff. Is there like a reason why you have that take on things?
well, I mean, okay, so I'm an engineer, and I'm licensed in several states, and I run my own engineering company, and I do most of the engineering work myself. Well, so I'm in that mode most of the day, right? And that's not to say that I'm that way about a lot of stuff. I feel very strongly about a lot of things. I'm very emotional about a lot of it. And it would, like when you're looking at the culture war stuff, I absolutely have a side, an ideological side in most of the things that go on in the culture war, but so does everybody else. And throwing my 2 cents into the pot as far as what the sides go isn't fundamentally that interesting. What's more interesting would be to try and figure out why the hell a culture war is happening. And that might allow us the tools to be able to navigate it and to resolve it. Because if you can't resolve it, then all it is just a bunch of war. And it doesn't do anybody any good, right? In order to try and end it, you'd need to understand it. And I have to catch myself. I'll write. I've got half a dozen articles that I've written that are just kind of like angry culture war screeds, and I sit on them. I decide not to publish them. This APA thing that happened on, I guess it was Monday, where they decided that traditional masculinity is evil or whatever words they used. Mm-hmm. Everybody's like freaked out about it. You got a whole lot of articles going on. I wrote one of those. I wrote it. He's editing it, and I'm just dirty bad. It's a culture war position, and when I'm writing, I don't want to take a culture war position because that doesn't actually help.
Right.
I go on Medium as a conscientious objector to the culture war, and that's tough. It's hard to maintain, but I feel like somebody's got to maintain it, and I feel like the best way to resolve it is not to fight it; it's to analyze it, to figure out why it's happening. And that's one of my frustrations with IntellectualDarkWeb. But I feel like they get too bogged down fighting it, and they don't understand how it works because they're participants. If you're down there in the trenches, you don't see the big picture. You don't see what's going on. And I think that if they spent more time analyzing what's actually happening, they could have more objective opinions, and they could also have more effect on what's going on.
Right.
That's been my thought with a lot of them fall into that. I like a lot of the stuff that Peterson is selling. I don't like all of it, but I think that he falls definitely into that trap.
Right. Well, it seems to me that the Weinsteins are the main ones who try to analyze the stuff that's going on, and Sam Harris isn't quite as big on that.
Yeah, Sam takes positions and kind of moves. He moves in. He does his thing, but sometimes he's just. I used to listen to the Waking Up podcast for a while, and I had to quit at some point because I was just getting too frustrated, bemoaning against my windshield when I'm driving around. Like, guys, why aren't you thinking about this? There's much more important stuff going on. He had one guy. I don't remember the guy's name. He was a professor at Duke University. He had written a book about honor cultures, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I remember that one.
Remember that one? Okay, so he was talking about, and he goes through different examples of honor cultures worldwide, and those are, not as interesting because they're not as engageable. And then he starts talking about baseball, and that was a great one because you have this deal where if the pitcher hits your batter, you have to hit the pitcher with the ball and all this kind of stuff. And because to kind of regain your honor for, your teammate getting pegged or that kind of thing. And I used to play soccer a lot, so I get where that comes from. But part of that I don't know if the author missed it or he just didn't think it was that important, or maybe Sam, I think completely missed it, is that the reason these things arrive is because of lack of faith in the authority, right? The baseball pitcher is going to hit the other pitcher with the ball because he doesn't believe that the umpire is going to appropriately punish the other pitcher for his transgression, right?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good example. Yeah. When authority systems fail, it's basically daring individuals to acquire justice by their own means.
Sure. Right. Exactly. And so this is, the thing that frustrates me is that that's a very important thing to understand for our own culture, not only historically. You see it erupt in in the 1800s, late 1700s, whatever it was, when you had like senators challenging each other to duels, and then you saw it when in the Wild West and that kind of thing. But you see it now, and nobody's realizing it, and because it ties right back into the gun material. The first article there were about guns and about gun policy and about the situation on the ground with guns, and the homicide problem is the numbers on the homicide problem are just absolutely tremendous. So homicide victimization rate, and let me couch this by saying I'm pulling numbers from memory, and so if you read a number in the article and it does not exactly the article, because I was staring at it, I was writing articles. Homicide victimization rate by demographic, United States is it's like 2.5 or 3 per 100,000 for white men. It's like 1 per 100,000 for white women. It's like 2.5 or 3 for black women, and then it's like 30 per 100,000 for black men. And then if you go up to by age bracket, like black teens, it's like 100 per 100,000. It's outrageous.
Wow.
So yeah, it's way big. The numbers just blow you down when you look at them. And why is that happening? And really, I think it. People say, "Oh, it's the culture," and saying it's the culture sounds like a way of blaming black folks for it. But really, what it is, I think, is that they don't trust the authority figure. Right? A lot of them are something. Many of them are wrapped up in the drug trade. Because it might be their only way to, it's a way to make more money than, working at the car wash or something stupid or whatever their best opportunity is outside of that. And there's no way you can go to small claims court to resolve a drug dispute. So the only way you can resolve it, the only way you can ensure how good your contract is by maintaining honor and honoring your contracts. So honor culture. And then the only way you can resolve someone doing something dishonorable in the contract is with violence. Right? So it works just like the Wild West, just like whatever, just like any other pocket of area that has a authority gap. And this authority gap is, you could say that it's caused in part by the drug war. And then it's also probably caused in part by, I'm not a huge person that beats on the drum of systemic racism, but the numbers in the justice system are kind of skewed. They look like systemic racism to me. If you want to look at it, it looks like there's some racist and how the verdicts and stuff like that are handed down. So they don't try. Snitches get stitches. That's a phrase for a reason, right? So you have a authority gap there, and the authority gap creates a vacuum. The vacuum produces an honor culture, and then the violence comes along with it, right? And that would have been a really important, really good thing to have in this podcast. And they talked for an hour and a half or 2 hours or something like that. I didn't even mention it. Wow.
Right. They were talking about honor as they were more focused on how it can be good in some ways, or let's not beat on honor culture too hard. They were sort of going at it with that rather than simply applying, we'll say, honor dynamics to contemporary problems.
Right. I mean, honor culture works all over the place. It works very well. It works in business. So, my best clients are clients that I don't get into. I'm a civil engineer. I don't, for some of my contracts with big firms, I have to sign a, contract enumerates every tiny little detail, right? But for the clients that I know and I trust, I write them a 2-page letter proposal and they sign it. I know they're going to do me right. They knew I'm going to do them right. And because we're both working off our honor, right? Neither of us would screw the other one because that would be a dishonorable thing to do. And so what that does, it has a feature to it. And the feature is that it doesn't need any lawyers and all the cost and expense and that go along with that. So what that kind of means is that if like everybody in an entire culture was honorable, you wouldn't need a whole lot of the government infrastructure, right? And if nobody in your country is honorable, you need a whole lot of government infrastructure that is not producing anything for you and gets burdensome and bogs your economy down and that sort of thing, right? So people who have different sensitivities to honor culture tend to fall in different places in the political spectrum, anarchy and autocracy. The folks who think that if everybody was just honorable, we wouldn't have any problems, they're more likely to be libertarian. And the people who think that everybody's out to screw everybody else and we need some kind of, we need some authority to resolve it or to tell everybody what to do, then they fall on the other side. So I think that there's a very, very important link between people's perceptions of honor and, how they vote and stuff like that.
I agree entirely. So I'll even speak from my own experience to kind of, I think, give you some anecdotal proof of that. So I'm, as a lot of folks already know by now, a very progressive person, big Bernie supporter, would be happy to vote for him again in 2020, unless someone younger with similar credentials also ran. But that's where I am. One of the frustrations I encounter when I'm trying to organize politically with other progressives is I guess you could say I feel like I work from a place of honor. So I'm in the South, right? I live about 15 minutes away from this professor that Sam spoke with, where he works anyway, about honor culture. So maybe it's not crazy that some of that has rubbed off on me, given where I live and have grown up. I live in Chapel Hill now. I originally grew up in a rural town here in North Carolina. A lot of the people in Chapel Hill, or the Triangle General, I would dare to say about half of them are not from North Carolina. A lot of them are New Yorkers who moved down here as the Triangle has developed. And so a lot of these progressives are that. I mean, several of our progressives are from Brooklyn that I know here in Chapel Hill. It's kind of interesting, but that's a fact. I mean, they're Jewish American, Italian American. They're not Scotch Irish like a red-blooded Southerner. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm familiar. I grew up in Oak Ridge, North Carolina, just outside of Greensboro.
Oh, okay.
Piedmont Airport. So I was there till we were 10. So I'm familiar with the area, and I go back every now and then and like visit old farmer neighbors and stuff like that.
Okay.
Go to the old mill of Guilford to get my grits for the year, kind of thing.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, one thing that I've noticed is in political organizing is when I'm trying to work, whoever is the elected leader of the organization, like the president or whatever. Specifically, I'm talking about an organization known as the Progressive Caucus of the North Carolina Democratic Party. I usually try to and this isn't just true of the Progressive Caucus, but it's true of anywhere in the Democratic Party where I'm involved or doing stuff. I usually try to let leaders lead like they were elected to do. I try to support their program or their agenda. I try to empower them to be successful. And if I have a problem with it, there's the next election within the party cycle to determine that. And then, of course, when people ask me to do things, when I volunteer for a position in the party, I keep my word about it. I found that this is actually not a very common thing that a lot of progressives do, to my continual frustration, that they can just volunteer for a job, and if they don't actually do the job, there's no sense of accountability or they'll elect a chairman or a president in an organization and constantly want to fight and resist and say this isn't inclusive enough, this isn't diverse enough, whatever the excuse is. And what I see is just a lot of stuff not getting done because we're too busy just trying to be. It seems to me like everyone's just too busy trying to be individuals, or people are in such a habit of resisting the man that anytime a minimal hierarchy emerges so that people can organize, they resist that because they need a man to resist.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic because, I mean, so you're talking Chapel Hill, Raleigh, Durham kind of area, and there's been a lot of, you're right, there have been a lot of people that moved there, but North Carolina it's a weird bird because of who settled there. And like, I don't know if you ever seen anything, there was a great Washington Post article a while ago. It was called, Which of the 11 American Nations Do You Live In? It had this map. You ever see this thing?
I have seen this. Like, there's one for, I think, Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. There's one for Appalachia.
What it went back to is that some researcher went and he looked at voting patterns by zip codes, and he characterized all the different laws that were passed and what the votes were on that laws based on certain value sets. And then he correlated those value sets with the type of people who settled there, like where they came from Europe or from wherever else, right? You know, and he was able to draw correlative boundaries, and he divided the whole country up into, instead of it being red state, blue state, was 11 different versions. So, so for instance, like the South has got like, you know, 4 or 5, I would say maybe 4 different factions. We think about it being red, but it's really not. So the Deep South, which is Atlanta, you know, or, you know, everywhere south of the Appalachians, was plantation country, and it was settled by British loyalists. And so the kinds of political dynamics you see in the Deep South are very much good old boy network. It's all who you know. You vote for the person who's got, you know, who's comes from the, you know, rich deep family or whatever. And then that spills through South Carolina and up into a little bit of southern North Carolina. But then you know, about halfway through, but then the area to the north of that is Tidewater. And you know, my mother's side of the family are all from Virginia and, you know, up in the Chesapeake Bay, and that's Tidewater stuff. And then there's like what they would call Greater Appalachia, which is the Appalachian north of northern Alabama, northern Georgia, western North Carolina, West Virginia, western Virginia, and Kentucky, and then it also spills down into Texas. And what Greater Appalachia was the one bit settled by the Scots, right? So they have a lot of inherent distrust in government. This is your, you know, Rand Paul territory. Mm-hmm. Whereas, you know, in fact, Kentucky is kind of the center of this geographically in the map, whereas your Deep South has a lot of appreciation for authority, even though they both fall on the kind of conservative side of the spectrum. And those 3 regions intersect, Greater Appalachia, Tidewater, and Deep South, right around where you're living right now. So mm-hmm. You don't even have necessarily a cohesive blend of Southern values there. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones too, or like the map had, like, you know, you've got a whole lot of, what do you got? You got the far west. I'm looking at the map now. I pulled it up. We were talking. You've got the left coast. So like not much of California is, you know, truly extreme progressive liberal, except for the coastal areas. Most of it by geography is the far west. And that's just kind of like Nevada, Idaho, Wyoming, that kind of thing, right? They all view things the same way. You've got this stretch that's the Midlands that was settled by different folks. You've got Yankeedom, which was settled by, you know, the New Englanders. So like all of New England folks have they have a lot of trust in government, especially at the local level, because again, they were settled by people, by Puritans, right? You know, and then sort of the southern, the very southern band of the United States, they have that designated El Norte, you know, or it's heavily influenced by Latino values in New Mexico and Arizona, southern Arizona, and Southern California. So, and there's some more too. It's kind of silly to go into all of it, but the thing that I found fascinating about that is that the values from the settlers carried down. And the reason they carry down is because one of our primary indoctrination paths is our parents. That's where we get a lot of our behaviors from, is from their being passed down. Now, you talk to somebody like Jeffrey Miller or maybe some of the other dark web guys, and they'll say that there's probably some genetics going to that too. And that's probably true. But there's also very likely there's a lag. What values you get from your parents are always going to be kind of on the traditionalist side of the spectrum, because the values that you get from your mom and dad, they learned 20, 30 some odd years ago, right? And they learned them from somebody who was learning them 20 or 30 some odd years ago. So the kind of values you gain from your parents are always going to be traditionalist by ratio if you look on say a traditionalist to progressive scale instead of like a liberal conservative or a red blue. And that's something that I think is really worth analyzing, this kind of traditionalist versus progressive, and also looking at where the indoctrination paths come from. Because you might not be able to predict the future in terms of what the next thing is going to be, whether it's transgender bathrooms or whatever, but you can predict a little bit the strength of these relative paths and which ones are likely to become stronger or weaker over time. And that really does play into the balance of power in this whole overall culture war thing, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think you sort of touch on why I'm running into what I do in North Carolina, because I can move just 45 minutes over from my rural town to Chapel Hill, and I'm being confronted with the consequences of these overlapping borders. And so my father raised me, if you're going to be somewhere on time, or if you're going to be at a place at a certain time, be there on time, be there 15 minutes early. That's the sort of way my father raised me. I keep the promises that I make. And I have every reason to think that if I don't keep my promises, if I don't do the things I'm going to say that I'm going to do, then nobody will trust me. Nobody will take me seriously. And I'm just not only letting other people down, but I'm letting myself down. Right. But that mindset does not, in the where the other cultures are started overlapping and sharing part of North Carolina, that mindset doesn't exist with these folks. And I'm kind of seeing that here, and how one's cultural upbringing, in terms of honor, can really have these kinds of political consequences. Because even though I still believe in progressive policies, what I'm willing to do to realize them is very different than what a lot of other progressives are willing to do to realize them.
Right. I think that part of the, it's like when I started looking at this culture war stuff, it was an offshoot from the gun stuff, because I was kind of freaked out by what I discovered in my own media traffic. And so I started building a separate set of tools. I'm not a sociologist, right? But I think a lot. And so I kind of developed my own thing out of what I knew. And so I kind of started with biology, right? And looking at parallels. And, so there's this narrative that people have been telling for a long time that, okay, first off, here's a narrative fact that I don't think is true. It's like human summit. And then the next one is that, we're beyond evolution, and that we're not evolving, and that, we've got all this kind of, how do you say it? We're disjointed from the processes of evolution because we're intelligent. And I think all of that is like subjectively bullshit, right? And we've got all these things that we think that are unique to us, like agriculture and war and economics and division of labor and slavery and all of that kind of thing, civil infrastructure, cities, all of those things, right? That we think make us unique. Like the ant kingdom has every single thing I just mentioned.
Really?
They have agriculture, they have war, they have slavery, they have division of labor. They have, and it all works off a decentralized network. There's no central brain telling these ants what to do. They have all of those things. Like for agriculture, their leaf cutter ants bring the leaves down, and then they have mold, and then the mold grows and they eat the mold. They have livestock. where they'll farm aphids. They'll carry aphid eggs and they'll tend them and they'll keep them safe in the ant hive, and then they'll bring them up and put them on the underneath side of corn leaves. I've seen them do it in my garden. They have wars, and their wars are nasty, and the goals of their war is not just to, establish a boundary. Their goal of the war is literally genocide of an adjacent ant colony. They get in, their goal is to kill the babies. And then, because then they get the resource, they get the area, get the territory. Sound familiar? Like all of those things are, and here's another thing. Okay, so we don't even dominate the planet. If you put all of the ants on a scale, they would be 25% of the terrestrial animal biomass by weight of the planet.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. So, and they've been doing this for 50 million years. They've had all the sort of things that we see in human culture, and they've had it way longer than we have. We haven't caught them yet, and they're running a really tight program. And when you look at if you look at societies, the strongest societies that perpetuate the most and are the most influential in world history and whatnot are the ones who are able to emulate those programs the best. And I ran into this, this thought because it's like I've got a son, and when you have a son, you start thinking about all kind of wretched stuff. I'm like, good God, my son's 7 years old. That means I only got 11 years to end war. How am I going to do that? I'm trying to figure out how war works. And, the truth about wars is, I was raised a Quaker. I'm a conscientious objector to war. Still am one. But a whole bunch of my family they're in the Army, and they're like officers in the Army. And I've got a cousin who's a general. And so war is kind of the family business. And so, but I know they're good people. And then, so how do you oppose it? Well, the problem is that once you start looking at it mathematically, you can't, because it's a Nash equilibrium in game theory.
Right.
The reason the ants war is because if there's two ant colonies next door to each other and one of them wars and the other one doesn't, the one who doesn't loses, and they get rubbed out, and the one that wars lives on and perpetuates its genes. Darwinism creates war at that level, and we're running the same programs. So how are we running them is the next question, right? So we've got this realization. How are we running the ant program? And the first off, well, how are they running it? You ask them that, and the answer is pheromones. They have each ant is a complicated bit of behavioral code that's activated by pheromones that they pick up from the ants around them. There's no central command, but they, walking down the ant hill, some ant says, gosh, we need a nursery, and he releases that pheromone, and the next, your ant smells it, and then he smells 10 ants in a row saying the same thing, and so he goes off to do that thing. And we receive the same signals in our, socioeconomic system by someone saying, golly, I wish there was an app on my phone that would allow me to have someone else come pick me up. And 10 people say that. And then we are willing to give, instead of pheromones, to give money. And then money acts as our pheromone. So that's how we maintain a decentralized system of action is, money. And money is just a barter token. Right? That's all it really is. Any kind of barter token would work as long as it was standardized to serve this function. But then the other thing is that how do we get the code? Because ants are born with rigid behavioral code, and it only evolves on a evolution scale. And we have come up with these ant programs in a relatively short amount of time. Really, it's kind of like the folks who set up the ant program that we're all running right now is kind of Hammurabi. It's like there have been some other ones that have been more centralized and they died out. You had the pharaohs and you had the Mayans and the Egyptians. And the Incas and the Aztecs were all centralized theology-based ones, right? The people in charge are God, and you do what they say. And then Hammurabi had this, okay, we're all going to be a little bit decentralized. They still had a very strong religious thing, and that was how they adjudicated disagreements and how they had, government and how they standardized money. The shekel was a hypothetical representation of a bag of grain, right? That's what it was. Each shekel was worth one bag of grain. They were on the grain system, like the gold system. So once you had that, then the things that worked, the more decentralized ones rubbed out. The ones that better emulated the ants rubbed out the ones that were worse at emulating the ants. And that's how we got where we are. That's kind of how we see everything going on. But we have evolved our programming. And that's where I started to, that was the tool that I latched onto to try and understand the culture wars. We've got hard code and we've got soft code. And we have some white space. We can fill that white space with indoctrination. The indoctrination could be something like, if you have to be somewhere, show up 15 minutes early. That's an indoctrination. No reason that that's necessarily true. It was just kind of installed in you and you abide by it. And then you go down to, you go visit Spain and everybody's 45 minutes late, but they've all been indoctrinated with a different version of what's right, and they compensate for that. So because they're all operating on a different program, it all works for them because you're operating on your program works for you. And then the only kind of conflict is when these two different programs interact, right? And then that is a culture war skirmish. Make sense?
It makes sense. So
that's the framework that I look at all this stuff with, is it's like this indoctrination, that indoctrination. And then you look at people who have their indoctrinations, they don't want to give them up because like giving up an indoctrination is hard. Then you have to decide what you're going to replace it with. And most people, once they're maybe 20, 25 years old, they're done being indoctrinated. They're like, I got these and these work for me and I'm not leaving them, right? And I'm the same way. And so the culture war is something that happens when people are adjacent to somebody else who has a different indoctrination, and the indoctrinations don't mesh, and so they fight, they argue, and this is where social media comes in, because it used to be that we were all pretty much isolated from everybody else. So if you had a different indoctrination than me, it was no big deal. But if I'm sitting here watching your Facebook feed all day and you're watching mine, and our indoctrinations clash, I get
right. So I can tweet the fact that I think you should be 15 minutes early, and a Spaniard can tweet the fact that they think I should be 45 minutes late, and now we're going to fight. Whereas before, there's an ocean between us. Who cares? But now there's not an ocean between us.
Right. And so these things are linked up. So the culture war exploded tandem with the explosion of social media because we were much more adjacent than we ever have been before. Indoctrinations, they were very different. And that does not necessarily mean that one indoctrination is better than another. It just means that different and incompatible. And then when they're incompatible, we have there's no way to resolve it, right? Because nobody's going to give theirs up because it's too hard to give up. And where I've tried to come from in general is, it's like, don't, and I say, I have to reel myself in on this, don't take a culture war position or if you do it from an efficacy standpoint. It's like, okay, well, this particular indoctrination doesn't work, not because it's wrong or it's stupid or my indoctrination is different. This culture position doesn't work for efficacy reasons. And then outside of that, make no statement, right? Because the truth is that in the end, the best one's going to win out because Darwinism. And so the question is, can we get there without fighting about it first? That's my thought. That's my frame of reference when I'm writing. And that's why I try and stick to the analytical side instead of emotional and talking about stuff. I mean, I think I probably wrote 12 gun articles so far, and I have not mentioned the Second Amendment once. And I've been ranked as high as number 3 in the politics writers on Medium, and I have never written the word Trump. And I don't think anybody else can make either of those claims.
No, that's it's hard to do that. I mean, I've mentioned Trump plenty of times in some of the stuff I've written. Although I try to make it a passing mention, not about him so much, but for you to not mention him at all, or the Second Amendment for that matter, while discussing gun issues. It's pretty impressive.
Adherence to the Second Amendment. So I'm a pro-Second Amendment person, and that's an indoctrination. And I think if I were to go down that path, down that rabbit hole, I can make some efficacy arguments about why gun ownership is better than, disarming public and that kind of thing. And a lot of other people do that, but I don't want to do that because that's not interesting. All that is me saying, I've been indoctrinated this way and you've been indoctrinated a different way. And we're never going to advance a discussion that way. We never move past the first square with that conversation. You might hate guns, I might like guns. So then what are we going to do? You can say 1,000 words that can all be boiled down to, I hate guns. And I can say 2000 that only boiled down to guns are cool, and we don't communicate, right? Once you have an ideological barrier, there's no osmosis there. So
Right. So I'm a progressive, but my stance on guns is I have things where I'm genuinely undecided, and I've gone back and forth from support to opposition to a point where I feel like there's so much that's up in the air not to know. What is, you think, the strongest argument about guns that's achieving what you want, which isn't getting caught up in the culture war so much, but simply just looking at the efficacy of it?
well, I mean, I think the left has a problem. They have a similar problem to the right about different stuff. Like a whole lot of people on the right want to act as if you could put the sexual revolution back in the box, right? They talk about why the sexual revolution is bad, and they want to fight it, and it's like this. It's not going away. So, and the people on the left-hand side can see this, and they can say, "Look, it's not going away." If anything, a lot of the people on the left don't even get this far. But like the introspective person on the left might say, what should we do about the problems that we do realize from the sexual revolution to plug the holes in what's going wrong now with society because of it? Things like single parenting, right? That same kind of dynamic happens with guns. Okay. 40% of the guns on planet Earth are in the hands of private U.S. citizens. And our gun per capita ratio, we have more guns than people in the United States. We are so far past the saturation point on guns that even if you hated guns, you need to first acknowledge there's no way to get rid of the guns. The guns are already there. They'll work for 80 years. They're simple, very strong tools. All you have to do is like clean them once a year, and they'll last for another 80. And they're easy to maintain. They're pretty easy to build. And so what we need to be doing, even if you hated guns, is we need to start by acknowledging the facts on the ground that there are too many guns to deal with, and therefore we should look at the problems that we see. Because the gun isn't a problem when it's sitting in a closet. The gun is only ever a problem when the bullet comes out the end and hits somebody and kills them. And sometimes that's not even a problem if there's a justified reason for it, right? But in general, the freakoutery about guns isn't actually about the gun; it's about death. And so what we need to do is you say, well, why did the bullet leave the gun on the way to kill the other person? What was the motivation for that instance? And if we started looking at that, that's where we can make hay. That's where we can improve things. And because I'm not saying that we can't improve things. Anything can be improved, but there's no way. I did one of the most recent articles I did on this topic. There was a American Journal of Public Health study that was a deeply complicated multivariate analysis of gun homicide. And it was, in my opinion, the gold standard of it. And it was the one that I referenced in the first article I ever put up in Medium that talked about how there's no bivariate correlation between gun homicide and gun ownership. And there's not. I mean, anywhere. You plot European countries, you plot world countries, you plot states in the United States, you plot anywhere you plot it, there's no correlation between the number of guns owned and the homicide rate on a bivariate basis, because gun homicides are a multivariate problem. There's a lot of things that influence them. Income inequality is the biggest one. Black population ratio is 5 or 6 times more predictive on a multivariate level than gun ownership rate is. And that goes, in my opinion, back to the honor culture thing we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And, and the prison industrial complex, because even when you strip that out and control for that as a separate confounder, that's still a significant one, which the AJPH study did. And so if you look at that, then they said that you would have for every 1% change in gun ownership rate, you would have a 0.9% change in homicide rate, gun homicide rate, right? That was what they did with their multivariate analysis. But people don't realize that that's a 0.9% change of a rate. And the rate for a homicide is like, I don't know, 2.5 or 100,000, right? So that's 0.009 times 2 100,000ths. That's the rate of people you change by changing it 1%. So if you do that on an incremental basis, and I did some graphs, and I was like, all right, so we've got 30% gun ownership rate in the United States, and let's pretend we could somehow drop that to percent by, drop it by half. And you also have to, and let's say you pretend that you're and dropping it by half, you are taking guns equally from grandmas and criminals, which you're not going to be. Right? If you do a buyback or something, it's going to be a bunch of old ladies that don't need a gun anymore, and they'll sell them back. A lot of the guns you're going to get back are, like for instance, if there was a gun buyback in Georgia, I would sell 2 guns back and use the money to buy ammo, right? So there's going to be a lot of guns you get that don't actually, guns that you buy back that aren't going to affect your ownership rate at all. And you only need one to kill somebody or kill yourself, and killing yourself is 2/3 of the problem, right? So let's pretend you were able to do all that, and let's pretend you're able to reduce your gun ownership rate, and also let's pretend that buying half the guns would reduce the ownership rate by half. And I'm not convinced of that at all. Let's pretend all those things, which are all assumptions that are liberal assumptions in favor of the gun buyback case. And then let's say you spend $750 a gun on the buyback, because you're going to have to, because a lot of guns are worth a lot of money, a lot more than $200 or $300. You would end up spending, I think I calculated up $64 million. You had to buy $64 million worth of guns to save one homicide.
Wow.
So for the cost of saving 10 homicides, you could fund the entire city of Atlanta budget for a year. We got like 70 homicides here a year. So could you maybe spend that on more police? Or could you spend it on fixing income inequality? Or could you spend it on work programs for the people you let out of jail for drug crimes? Right? See what I'm saying? The efficacy of looking at the gun problem just doesn't work. It just doesn't work mathematically. And that doesn't even have anything to do with like the right to own a gun. In some ways, I think the Second Amendment is almost a moot point, because there's no way to get the guns back without a bunch of guys with a whole lot more guns. And you're going to send the National Guard door to door. That might backfire, because the National Guard kind of like guns too, and they have friends that are retired that have them. So that there's no functional way to address that. It's a Pandora's box issue. It's like the sexual revolution. Put it back in the box. It's out there. It's done. Accept it and move on. Figure out other ways to deal with the problem. And then they never want to talk about the actual problem. 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. 7/8 of those are men. And while gun ownership rate does actually track with gun suicide rate, it only does in men, not in women. The 1/8 of the gun suicides, if you reduce the amount of guns on a state-by-state basis, when you do an analysis on that, the women just find other ways to kill themselves if they're that intent on killing themselves. But the men, because I guess men are more emotional and violent and hastier or whatever, there's probably some kind of personality thing. You could come up with an excuse for that. Having a gun in the house as a man does increase your chances of suicide, because men are more likely to choose the gun as the method. And guns are a really good way to do it. And you only need one. You don't need an extended magazine. It doesn't matter what kind of gun it is. Pistol, rifle, shotgun. And that's 2/3 of your gun deaths. So, the most important thing we could do for the gun deaths problem, and this is the whole point of the second article, and it shows up in the 5th or 6th one also, is just an awareness campaign to gun owners that if they're having suicidal thoughts, they need to give their guns to a buddy for a little while. If you just did that, then you might save 5,000 deaths a year. You might put a bigger dent in the overall gun death problem than any other possible policy. And that 5,000 deaths a year, that'd be 5 times the entire total of domestic violence deaths of women annually.
Yeah, that reminds me of this classroom we had when I was in the Army. about a suicide in the military, and they talked about these soldiers stationed in Iraq, and one had been dumped by his wife, and so his best friend, without telling him, stole the firing pin in his M4. And then when the guy was on watch one night in the tower at the base, he was still miserable. He took the M4, put it to his chin, and pulled the trigger, but it didn't fire.
Holy, that guy's a hero.
Right, so he took his gun apart immediately and saw the firing pin wasn't there, went back to barracks, and he ran into his buddy, and he told him what happened, and he's like, yeah, I took the firing pin. All right, so this was an example the Army decided to put on to sort of like, hey, take initiative if you have concerns about your friend to prevent suicide. And yeah, I mean, that's it right there. It's suddenly this guy wasn't about to kill himself, right? He didn't, like, I don't know if it would have been possible, but he was up on a high tower. He didn't jump off of it to try and kill himself. He just, as soon as the gun couldn't kill him, he stopped.
Right. I mean, that happens a lot in suicide, right? I mean, a lot of people will slit their wrists and then wait 3 minutes and be like, oh shit, that was stupid. I should call 911. That's not uncommon with suicide, but you don't get to do that if you choose the gun as your method, as your route. And that shows up in the literature too, is that men choose guns to commit suicide at a much higher rate than women do. And so that's the deal. That's amazing. It's tough for the Army though, because like, one, they can't just take the guns away. It's like everybody needs a gun in the Army,
Right. Exactly. But even then, when guns are everywhere, you found a way to basically do what you said, is just take away we'll say the capacity to fire the bullet. And the problem was basically resolved with that. And they got him the help he needed. And, he was then talking in that video, and he's happy. He's like, oh, I'm so grateful to my friend for looking out for me. Yeah. And I think that's we need like that sort of preemptive look at like, well, one, I think, is have a habit where people give their guns to their friends, but also I suspect some of it's just, and this is often talked about anyway, but maybe not enough, is more focus on mental health services and assets to people in this country, so that if they're in that state or they're progressing toward that suicidal state, it can be dealt with before they get to the point where they're so miserable and brooding alone in their room, and then they go for the gun.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's important, but on the flip side, a lot of men are afraid of going to the counselor because they're afraid of what the counselor's going to say. And I think that like the APA thing that hit this Monday, that's going to make it worse instead of better. This whole idea that traditional masculinity is on the whole bad, end quote.
Right. That is a good point. I think probably also it's more of an issue even before that, or it's more of a social issue for men to seek therapy than say women.
Yeah, I think that tendency with the general tendency towards that kind of advice. I mean, I don't know this for sure because I've never been to a counselor, but I think the tendency towards that kind of approach probably existed before the APA. I think the APA document that came out, might have just outlined, the thinking of that many therapists are already doing. I know I've talked to some people who ended up going to marriage counseling, and they ended up with a marriage counselor that was basically kind of just preaching kind of social justice choir stuff to them, and it wasn't helpful. In the same way that, I mean, like that could be helpful for some people if they've already bought into the program, but going to your preacher and him saying you need to rededicate yourself to God and acknowledge your original sin and that kind of stuff, that might work very well for Christians too, right? But
oh yeah, definitely.
Is it the APA's place to be pushing the social justice indoctrination as opposed to a Christian indoctrination or another indoctrination to solve problems? I don't think so. What it does is it makes the, counseling is supposed to be like safe place you can go. And if you're literally bringing a culture war, if you're making that a culture war battleground in that safe space, let me tell you, a rumor about that's going to fly pretty quickly among the male community, and a whole bunch of men aren't going to go to therapy. And that's what's going to happen. And that's what's that's what's, and so then, now you have a whole bunch of people who are screaming about it, right? And they're adopted their culture war position with it. And the thing that intrigues me more than anything else about it, I mean, what's interesting about the fact that they did that? It's not that interesting that they did it. Kind of almost par for the course given how 2018 went. But what's truly interesting to me is that.
Now, when you say how 2018 went, are you talking about like Me Too or something?
Yeah, all of that stuff.
Okay.
Sort of continual thing. Like if you looked at, for instance, the traffic on, just look at the traffic on Medium. Like what were the featured articles for 3
Yeah,
years?
that was huge. Kavanaugh, Me Too stuff.
An article after another. There was the one that really was just one of the most egregious was men are 100% responsible for unwanted pregnancies.
Yeah.
Like, are you kidding me?
Well, what was interesting is I saw a gradual evolution in that general thing. So for the Me Too stuff, I feel earlier in the year, it was oriented more toward, we'll say, educating people about what the norms for acceptable behavior is in human sexuality. Okay. And there was this, I feel like I gradually noticed, and especially looking at what featured stories on Medium were, is that it went from that toward being, well, here's why men are evil, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that really, like, as we got to the end of 2018, I was really taken aback by that.
People that I've known and respected for 20 years, women who were, screwing around on Facebook, laughing about how ridiculous the idea that not all men is a appropriate response to that. They were like, no, you can't say not all men. Well, why not?
Right. Like, what about gay men? Are they groping women?
Yeah, well, okay, gay men, that's obvious. Oh, no. So, okay, now you're into your social justice critique. Gay men aren't on the total pole of oppression like straight men are, and so therefore you can punch at straight men but not gay men, or whatever, right? That's kind of the mindset that got spelled. But getting back to it, to my earlier point, it's like we can critique that, but critiquing it is not actually that interesting. I think the critiques are almost kind of obvious and banal, and you just open up your web browser and see 100 of those. What's interesting to me is that the APA didn't realize the kind of reaction they were going to get. And they didn't apparently realize that stating this, traditional masculinity is on the whole bad thing would prevent men from seeking therapy. Like, how could they not realize that?
Oh, yeah.
That, it speaks to nobody is fully objective, all right? Everybody has their own subjective thing that's informed by their world frame, and the world frame is formed by their echo chamber, okay? What kind of echo chamber must they be in to not realize the kind of effect that issuing that statement would have? That's an interesting thing to think about.
And it totally makes sense because, I've noticed for my own self that if I ever wanted to talk to people about problems, or the people that I might consider good to talk about problems with, is that number has gotten smaller and smaller because as this meme of men are evil has grown, as this meme of toxic masculinity has grown, which is clearly just what they want to call all masculinity, as that's become so pervasive, you have to think, well, people are just going to hear me talking about normal thoughts, normal behaviors, and they're going to have this visceral ideological reaction of, well, that's just your toxic masculinity. I just shouldn't talk to people about my problems, particularly if they cause me to check certain boxes on the list about the way they think and what they say. If I hear them say certain buzzwords, don't ever talk to this person about your problems. They will just make it worse. Yeah. And that's just ordinary people. Now you have the APA come out and basically do that. It's bad enough when I feel like when men feel like they can't talk to ordinary people in their lives because of this, but when now the professionals are shutting the door in their face, what does that mean? It's hard to really think of what the consequences might be.
Well, I think the consequences are going to be simple. Less men are going to go to therapy.
Right. Well, the consequences are painful to think about, I'll say.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the obvious response. It's less men are going to go to therapy, and and to your other point, I mean, less men are going to talk with certain women less. I can think of a couple of women who I used to consider very close friends. I now kind of have to view them as acquaintances, and probably wouldn't share very much with them because they fell in that rabbit hole in the end of 2018. I don't know what they think about me now, and it's just easier to stay away from them than risk some kind of blow up or whatever. But again, it's just a personal problem, and so something I'm going to write about. And that, so what my response to a lot of this stuff has not been to bemoan it. It's just been to, all right, well, okay, so maybe that's terrible, but also that's interesting. Like, is this the kind of thing that's happened before in mankind's history? And what happened then? That might give us a sense of where this thing is going. And is any of this truly new? Is it a result of, and I think it's very largely a result of the way communication changed. I was talking with a professional buddy of mine earlier today, actually, about, one of the things that I've fallen into, it's like I got into that sort of the dark web kids, beginning 17, like a lot of other people did. And I kind of transitioned towards the end of 2018. Towards the end of last year, I started paying attention almost specifically to Slade Star Codex. And Scott Alexander is really intelligent, and the people who follow him are you get in some great conversations with people who are versed in that corner of the internet. And the interesting thing about this sort of weird, social justice artifact that we're seeing develop is it's like a James Lindsay put out that I don't know, hour-long read on Arrow that was correlating it to a religion, and I'd written something similar, but I mean, my take on it I think was different, or I hope it was. I mean, I think a lot of people kind of missed the point of that article, and maybe go back and reiterate what the actual point was. Is that what's interesting about social justice is not that it's a religion type object. Whether it's a religion or not is almost a semantic argument. How are you going to define it? What's interesting about it is that it was crowdsourced. It was not a burning bush. It was not one dude. It was not a cult that grew into a religion. It was a whole bunch of different people putting a whole bunch of different things together and then reinforcing each other using the social media tools. Right? And that is, as far as I'm aware, something wholly new and different in the history of mankind. And let me tell you, golf clap. That's cool. That's really wild. Now, I would contend, and I do contend that, it's not put together very well. And I think the reason it's not put together very well is they didn't realize what they were doing. They still probably realize what they're doing, and they'll tell you, no, it's not a religion, whatever. It's like, well, it kind of is. I mean, look at the qualities of religion, look at the qualities of social justice. It walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. But what could somebody do if they were trying to do the same project, knew from the beginning what they were doing? Could they cook up something new? Or could they take the baseline indoctrinations from an existing old world religion and could they isolate the meaning structures within that religion that work for reasons, and maybe work for scientific reasons, or because they have a relationship with how the biology of the brain works, or how what makes society strong, or something like that? Could they take those things and then crowdsource a way to turn it into a new thing, or revision, a second reformation? Could they do that? Could that be the thing that carries us into the 22nd century? Like, if somebody could take the social justice project and just presume, okay, look, this is a religion, it was a beta test, they may be able to fix it. They might not. If they don't, it's going to fall apart. I mean, there's a whole bunch of conflicting stuff in it. Like, does the lesbian who denies having sex with the transgender female who has a penis, is she transphobic? Like, that's kind of the scissor statement for social justice. Get them to figure that one out for me. Like, I don't.
Right. There are so many internal contradictions like that. Right. if not now, at some point will create rifts in these current alliances?
I think they're happening right now. I mean, and they're happening in kind of a big way. It's still kind of under the surface, but like I've talked with some folks that are, you know, relatively left wing, but they're pro gun, and they've been drug into these like secret groups of like, you know, secret gay groups on Facebook that are like, we don't know what to do with the social justice thing. It's crazy. It doesn't work. It's not what we signed up for, you know. So, you know, I think that's probably happening right now in a political sense. Like, what happens if the thing unravels in late this year, early next year, right in front of the election? I mean, you know, that could have political implications. That could be weird. But, you know, in a grander sense, in a more human progress kind of sense, what if somebody takes the thing, realizes it was a beta test, figures it all out, and says, all right, I'm going to put together a new crowdsourced religion mode. We're going to know what we're doing from the beginning, and we're going to figure it all out and make it work right. Something more like Linux is, because it's kind of like religion in some ways is kind of like an operating system for society, because what it is it's a universal indoctrination installation machine, and the indoctrinations, for all, are the operating software that's overlaid into the biological framework that helps us better emulate the ants. And could we, if that indoctrination spread was strong and interesting enough and crafted in the appropriate way and done such that it was so viral that it was able to overtake all the world's nations, could you end war with that? And you could end around the game theory, right? This is the kind of stuff that I've been thinking about this for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, and it only recently dawned on me that like this sort of like crowdsourced religion concept was already being beta tested by other folks, because that's what it is.
Right. Well, it seems to me that it's a good thing that you're thinking of things in that way, because particularly as what I would say, it's generally speaking thinking about it all mathematically. So the reason for that is I work from under the assumption that everything that's going on in existence is some kind of mathematical system in play. And so a way of looking at it is human behavior is basically a very complex mathematical system based on constituent mathematical systems that add up into human behavior. So some of these constituent mathematical systems would be things as simple as chemistry, right? The way chemicals in our bodies react, and then how that produces certain human behavior. That's one thing. Some of these other mathematical systems can be meteorology. The weather and the climate have impacts on human behavior and factor into political and economic developments. Some of these other things can just be even more abstract. Like, so when we talk about whether or not things scale, right? You can apply something like an economy of scale to actual economies or to things that are figuratively similar to economies. And these are all mathematical systems that exist in a universe that is consistently quantifiable no matter what field of study you want to do. If you want to talk about the universe in terms of astrophysics, that's quantifiable. If you want to talk about the universe in terms of biology, that's quantifiable. And you can make very useful summaries and predictions about the universe through this quantification process and the seeing of patterns.
You know, I think that what you said is, you know, to me, it's almost too obvious. The problem that you see where people come into it, they're like, oh, but what about creativity? You know, and that kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing where chaos comes into play, and nonlinear dynamic systems come into play. And I'm a fluid mechanician, and fluid mechanics is one of the weirdest corners of physics, because like in static mechanics, you have an object and it's under strain and it's under stress and it's being pushed, it's being pulled, but it's not moving itself. And fluids get weird because every particle in a fluid flow, it is moving because of its momentum, right? Its momentum influences its direction, its vector. right? But its direction and its velocity and its acceleration. But because fluids move, they carry the properties with them. And like they might carry the fact that there's a blue dye tracer in the flow that you can see, or the fact that there's smoke coming off your cigarette, right? That carries the smoke particles with it. And you can use that that's one of the frameworks for describing fluids is by streamline instead of by Cartesian position. But the curious thing about fluids is that one of the qualities that it carries with it is its momentum. And so then its momentum is being moved by its momentum. And so there's kind of a recursive layer to that. And when you boil out the Navier-Stokes equations, which are like a really god-awful system of 27 nonlinear differential equations and 27 unknowns, they're a huge headache. Nobody can solve them except for, then we can solve them directly except for, but when you look at the terms, you have some laminar terms, which is where the fluid's moving straight in flow, and it's not doing much that's interesting. And this is like molasses moving out of the jar. And then you have, so those are your laminar terms. And you have turbulent terms. And once the momentum exceeds a certain point, and you can characterize this with something called a Reynolds number, you can boil it down, and anytime the Reynolds number of flow exceeds somewhere around 3,000, then things move from laminar to turbulent. And you can see this again with your cigarette. So you light your cigarette and you look at the smoke, and the smoke's coming off the edge of the cigarette. And the first 2 or 3 inches of the smoke is straight up because the fluid starts at 0 velocity and it's accelerating as it goes up. So the velocity increases the more it goes up. And when it increases past a certain point, its Reynolds number kicks in, and then it's the flutter, right? So the fluttering of the smoke from a cigarette is turbulence. And that's when the recursive dynamics of the nonlinear differential equation kick in. And you'll see when you say, oh, well, human thinking is just math. Like, people don't like to think about that because they're like, well, then that would be determinate. That would mean that if you had all the equations, then you could just predict what somebody was going to do. And that's not true, right? We know that's not true. Like, I don't know what I'm about to say next. But that flutter, that turbulence within the mathematics gives us a way to describe creativity, because you can't know which direction that smoke is going to flutter in the next instant. You can kind of know, but not really. I mean, you can get really into really deep computational fluid dynamics models, but it's not the kind of thing that you can easily describe in the equation. And even then, it's not regular because it's turbulent. It flutters around. A flag flapping in a breeze. But that turbulence can be used to describe things like thought. And you can bring in chaos theory. And you can bring in some other things like that say, all right, well, once you have a system that's complicated enough, it stops being linear and it starts being creative, right? And there's some Reynolds number of neuron interactions. And if the brain is small enough, it's not creative. And as soon as the brain gets big enough, it's going to kick over that number, that Reynolds number of the brain, and it's going to suddenly be capable of creative thought. Does that make sense?
Right. There's definitely a point of critical mass among organisms with brains where like, say, deer, for example, are probably smarter than, say, cockroaches, but they're not capable of abstraction like we are.
I mean, I'm not sure that they might be, they might not be. Are you sure about that? I don't know.
I'm running just a general assumption that mammalian brains are better than most insect brains.
Oh no, I think that I'm talking about the claim of deer's not being capable of abstraction. I mean, deer aren't dumb. They're smart on the animal kingdom scale. And maybe they can and maybe they can't. And then abstraction might be one measure, and then creativity might be another measure. I mean, like a deer might have creativity that runs from a wolf.
Well, I suspect I can't teach them what concepts are, but particularly like non-physical concepts. Like, I can't tell a deer about democracy.
Okay. I mean, well, democracy is it's a layered concept. It's a concept and there's a government. And government means that you have to go back and you have to recurse all the way down. It doesn't necessarily mean that all that really is just how much stuff have you had brain so far. If you found some, Burmese pygmy or some, isolated human or something like that, you might not be able to teach it the concept of democracy. You might not be able to teach an ape. You could teach an ape sign language, and that ape can exhibit creativity, and you still might not be able to teach them democracy. So that might not be a good example. And maybe we need to be looking at different stuff as our threshold boundary, like a different, we can't teach them democracy. Sometimes I think we can't teach us democracy.
So I guess you're getting at, since it's a layered concept, it's basically an interaction of multiple concepts, and the more layers of a concept, generally speaking, the larger the brain would have to be. So maybe a deer can understand a very fundamental concept like who its mother is.
In a social hierarchy.
Right. But beyond that, where it's something like democracy, which the concept of democracy implies several other concepts. That's because there's those layers from it. It requires extra, we'll say, cognitive processing power to be at work. Like I have to draw on these other concepts in order to form this other concept of democracy in my head.
We're going to have language, right? I mean, the whole thought experiment we're exploring here almost makes the presumption we're able to talk to a deer, right? Okay. So, but presuming I could speak deer, I'm not that sure I couldn't teach deer democracy, because they've got a social hierarchy. They got a big old buck right there, and the buck's got a bunch of does, and then some other bucks can come along and they're going to fight. And then whoever the biggest buck is going to get the does. That's their social hierarchy. I think. I'm not a deer expert. I'm speculating, but this is how I understand it to work, right? Well, we've still got governments that work like that. That's kind of how the Middle East works in some ways of late, where, the guy who's in charge of a country is standing on top of a pile of bodies with an AK-47. He's shooting somebody else. Anybody else tries to climb on top. That's what Putin was. And if we depose him, then what that means is that somebody else is going to climb to a higher pile of bodies, and they are obligated by their choice of government system to stand on the top of the bodies with that AK-47 and keep shooting. If they don't, somebody else will. It's a Nash equilibrium. The only way you can break out of it is when everybody all gets together all at the same time and decides, we're not going to do the shooting part anymore. We're going to do the voting part. And we're going to have a peaceful transition of power, which is, by the way, probably one of the only redeeming features of our system. It's not a very good system to pick people to lead us. We would never choose a CEO of a company by what we do on the ballot box, by a popularity contest. But the fact that we have a peaceful transition of power is a huge feature. That's tremendous. That's really cool. And because we don't have to get into these, every 4 years shooting each other. I'm a little bit worried that we had to lose that. But, that's kind of a separate.
Okay. Well, this so far has been pretty interesting. One thing I want to get onto before we close out is I really want to talk specifically about your article on preppers.
Okay.
Yeah, and because I thought that was interesting. I thought they're kind of preppers. I think are kind of maybe an easy punching bag, whatever you think politically, because they're a bit odd. They're kind of a meme, but you offered some insight into it that even I, sort of had to say, well, they're not there. I can't look at them the same anymore. So why don't you just get into that?
Well, the history of that article is kind of funny, because I wasn't even going to approach the concept of why anyone would need an AR-15 in my entire gun series articles, because the numbers are clear. Like rifle, all classes of rifles are responsible for like 0.7% of gun deaths. It's very tiny. And AR-15s are an even smaller number than that, because not every rifle is an AR-15, and nobody is even sure how many AR-15 deaths there are. They're so tiny. So it's like the whole thing is a red herring. But I wanted to write about this because the article's not really about AR-15s, but it gets there in the end, because everybody's always, what the hell you need an AR-15 for anyway? And, the truth about a lot of the folks who own them is that let's take a step sideways before we even start the article and talk about like guns for a second. I mean, like, what do you need a handgun for? Handguns are for killing people. They're not for hunting. They're okay for target practice, but target practice is practicing to kill people. And handguns are concealable, and handguns are the best murder weapon. That's why 90% of homicides are a handgun. But so what's an AR-15 for? It's technically only for a running medium-range gunfight with other armed opponents. That's what it's for. It's not even that particularly good a school shooting weapon. I mean, like, you know, you could do the same thing with handgun. People do, these crazy school shooters do. Not that school shooters are statistically, probably they're not. But the people who are buying them are thinking about this other stuff. And it's the kind of thing that I think about a lot because I'm a stormwater hydrologist. And that's, you know, you don't buy it for the routine event. I'm not going to use it tomorrow, I hope. But I might use it sometime in the next 50 years. And what do I do professionally? One of the things that I do a lot of different stuff, but one of the things I do is floodplain maps. And the way you generate a floodplain map is you start with flow. And you determine the worst rainfall you expect to see in an area in 100 years, statistically. It spits out so many inches of rainfall in a 24-hour period. And then you characterize a watershed. So if the whole thing is a bunch of sandy forest, most water is going to leak into the ground. And if the whole thing is a bunch of Walmarts, most water is going to run off the Walmart and into the creek. And so there's a different amount of water that will get into the creek or river depending on what the watershed looks like. And that goes back to watershed size, slope. It's complicated. And by the time you've done all that, you end up with a flow rate. So how many buckets per second, right? And then you do hydraulics, which is that, stuff we briefly talked about earlier that determines how deep the water is going to be when the creek is carrying that much water. And then you go to a map and you draw the boundary of where that's going to be. And you publish that in the National Flood Insurance Program. And FEMA keeps these maps. And it's one of the most important things FEMA does on a regular basis is provides you the means to look up your house that you're about to buy and see whether it's in a floodplain or not. It's your, so do you want to buy the house in the floodplain? It's only a 1% chance of flooding because that's what a 100-year storm is. It's a 1 in 100 chance on an average annual basis that it will flood. Well, maybe take the risk. Well, here's the problem, is that if you're not going to own the home 1 year, first off, you're going to have a 30-year mortgage. So the bank is going to own the home for 30 years or some future bank or something, right? So they don't want to know what the chance is that it floods out in 1 year. They want to know the chances it floods out in 30. Okay, so the math for that works like this. Like a 1% chance of flooding is a 99% chance of not flooding. And the chance of not flooding 2 years in a row is 0.99 for the first year times 0.99 for the second year. So like 0.99 squared. So that'd be 0.9801, right? And the chance of not flooding 30 years in a row would be 0.99 to the 30th power. So it's like 0.7397. So a 74% chance of not flooding. And that's a 20% chance of flooding over a 30-year span, right? Does that make sense?
Right.
So that 1% chance per year, it doesn't add up in a arithmetic sense, but it does add up in an aggregate sense. Percent chance of a flood in your floodplain over the 30-year span of the mortgage, so your bank doesn't give you your loan, right? Okay. But you can do the same kind of math with violent revolutions in the United States. And it's, what are the chances of a violent revolution? It's tough to determine, but we could just use the two examples that we have. Like since colonization, we've had two of them, and there's been about 340 some odd years here since colonization. You've got the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. One of them worked, one of them didn't, but they're both qualifying events. So that's like a 0.58%, 0.59% chance per year. And then, all right, well, are we worried about a mortgage? Now we're worried about kind of like how long we live. So over an average lifespan is 78.7 years, you do the same math and you find out there's a 63% chance that there's not going to be a revolution in your lifetime, which means a 37% chance that there's going to be one. And that's large. That's not small. And we covered earlier that these guns don't expire. So buy a gun now, put it in your attic, wait. If there's a revolution 30 years from now, at least you've got one. Now, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to fight the government? The preppers aren't. If you talk to prepping people, they're not lining up to fight the army. They're mostly making sure that they can defend their bags of rice and rain barrels and such from the kinds of people who show up when there's no central authority anymore. And, so is that 0.5% chance per year? Is that high or low? Well, I mean, that's not a bad estimate based on historical data, but if you kind of look at the comps, you look at how many violent revolutions you've had in other countries around the world, the big ones have them more often than that. Like Russia, God, I mean, Africa's hard to even figure out where to start with that number.
Uh-huh. And
so here's another thing too, like a risk analysis professional would not do a historical frequency analysis at all, right? That's kind of the way, meteorologists and such handle it because of hydrology. They would be looking at indicators, like on the ground indicators, right? So they would be putting together some kind of model that would say, all right, well, based on, what some kind of factors, the chances are going to increase, right? So things like, but what are those factors going to be? Like partisanship, civil disorder, people talking about coups, wealth gaps are a big one. The Army does studies on wealth gaps. When the wealth gaps get big enough, there's revolution. Something that I've heard higher ups in the Army talk about at cocktail parties. When your oligarchy starts to entrench, articles run around a couple of years ago talking about how we're basically an oligarchy. Kind of obvious when you have Hillary and Trump both attending the same cocktail parties in New York City and they were running against each other. And then if you've got people walking around the streets dressed like Antifa, Antifa are dressing exactly like the actual fascists, the Italian black shirts used to.
I've noticed that.
It's you've got, and then, you have your occasional attempts at political assassination, and they're happening on both sides. You've got your weird, your mail bomb thing right before the midterms, but you also had some ricin bombs right before the midterms. And you also had that, I know you're a Bernie fan, but there was one of his fans took a rifle out to a Republican baseball game, shot them up. So you've got these kind of things happening on the boundary that would be the kind of things that a risk analysis professional would ascertain a % chance per year. And I read an article in the New Yorker talking about this, I don't know, early in the year, way before it became popular, it's like the Civil War or anything. And they were talking to risk analysis guys, and some of them were ex-Army intel, saying they thought that you might be up to a 20 or 30% chance inside the next 10 years instead of the next 7, like I calculated. So they think that these sectors that we're watching are increasing the chance that this happens by a lot. And you can also see this in how people are reacting. So you've got there's a company in Texas that builds bunkers for rich people. And their biggest clients are in Los Angeles, Silicon Valley. And these are liberal hubs. And when the prepper folks find that out, they're like, wait a minute. These people are talking about seizing all the guns in public and they're building a bunker in private. That means I got to buy more ammo. Right? So, do I think that the preppers are all doing the math? No, I don't think so. But I think they have an intuitive sense of it. I really do, from, talking to folks.
And that thing just sort of gets back to the point before about how a lot of human behavior is basically, it's just some sort of mathematical calculation that's maybe processed more in our genome than in our brains.
Well, maybe. Intuition is sensing patterns from, experience without necessarily sitting down and doing the cognitive assessment. That's what intuition is. And yeah, I think there's a lot of preppers going off intuition, but I think their intuition is backed up by the math. I think if you just sat down with mathematically and said, wait a minute, there's a chance of this thing happening. And there's a lot of Silicon Valley people who are like, yeah, there's a chance of this thing happening. If I got $10 million, I might as well spend, $10,000 on a Harley, a rifle, and some, gold coins or something like that. There's a lot of stories of those guys telling that. So, what good will it do you? I don't know. But here's the thing about owning a rifle. mean, you don't have to use it. It's smart to practice with it so you know how to use it, but it's not like owning a rifle makes you kill anybody. You can put it in a closet and lock it up. Well, when people ask me, like, why would you own one of these things? I'm kind of like, well, why wouldn't you own one? I can't think of a reason not to buy one, really. And well, no, I can. If you're suicidal, you should not have a firearm in the house. We've covered this earlier. If you are irresponsible and you don't think you can lock it up with kids around, you shouldn't have it in the house. There are reasons to not have a firearm in the house, and I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that there aren't. But I mean, if you check all the tick boxes on gun safety and gun storage, and you're not crazy and you're not suicidal, then I don't see any reason not to have one, because bad things might happen.
Right, and then it's the classic case of I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
Yeah. I mean, like, if suddenly anarchy erupts around you, it's not like you can go to the store. Let me tell you, the first place it's going to get robbed is a gun store.
Oh yeah.
First place can be defended too. It's going to be a battleground, right? So
it's storming the Bastille.
Yeah.
Well, that I think really does make a lot of sense. If we just talk about the intuition of the preppers here, in some ways I feel like intuition is just it's doing very simple math through the pattern recognition, right? Like I don't necessarily need to get a precise measurement or amount to know that something is like twice as big as it was, right?
I think it might be doing extremely complex math. It's just difficult to write down.
Okay.
Like your Google deep dreaming and stuff like that. I think that those things are pushing the boundaries of what might be considered intuition, more than they're pushing the boundaries of what might be considered cognition. There's so what was the one? I think it was like Amazon built an AI that they got in a whole bunch of trouble for to try and vet resumes. Do you remember this one? This happened in the middle of last year.
I don't remember this.
Oh, they got a huge stink for it because they went and they processed all the resumes that they had and ran it through a deep learning generator and then trained it against who got hired and didn't get hired. And then they discovered by the time they had the thing done, when they were running it, that it was racist.
Okay, I remember this now, yes.
Right? And the reason it was racist is because it was trained against the data that they gave it to train, right? Didn't teach it to be racist. It just had a racist intuition because it was basing itself based on prior results, right? Now, an artificial neural network is a very complex, weird thing that mirrors the learning measures in a brain, right? I mean, you have a bunch of little nodes. You've got an input layer where you feed in your input, like the words on a resume, and then you have a bunch of hidden layers where it's just a box, and you feed the box data, and then the box applies an equation to the data, and then it's the next thing in the equation has like one or two variables or like knobs you can tweak, and then it goes layer by layer. There's 2 or 3 or however many hidden layers, and then it spits out output. And so you put it in without turning any knobs, you get output that's really wrong. And then you go turn the knobs a little bit, and then you run it again, and it's still mostly wrong. You turn the knobs a little bit, and as you get warmer, you turn the knobs closer and closer. And if a human were to do this, it would take them 10,000 years, but we have a computer that can turn knobs fast. So then you say, all right, computer, take 2 days and turn these knobs, and then by the time it's done, it's learned to mirror the data, and that's what deep learning is.
Right. That's sort of how AlphaZero has become such a successful chess program.
Yeah, probably. I mean, if I was writing a chess program, I don't know much at all about how AlphaZero works, but if I were writing a chess program, I know exactly what I would do is I would go to chess.com. I would get every single chess game that has ever been played on chess.com because they save those. All of that stuff goes into a database. That's like their cool thing.
Right.
And then I would just train a ANN against those.
Well, that's basically what they did. They didn't have it take in existing data, but they just had AlphaZero play games against itself really fast, and it played thousands and thousands of games and learned chess. Whereas previous chess programs, they had tried to basically develop formulae based on heuristics and constantly refine that. Mm-hmm. But AlphaZero beats the best versions of those programs because AlphaZero.
You didn't have to teach AlphaZero what a fork was or what a review.
Right. AlphaZero sort of learned through immense trial and error and made that the basis by which it saw patterns and learned the fundamentals of chess.
I bet if those same AlphaZero people took and like set AlphaZero aside and they started with the same neural network framework, but they started it blank and untrained, and instead of training it against a billion hypothetical chess games like AlphaZero has done, I bet if they trained it against historical game record on chess.com, that they could end up with a resulting AI that made very different moves. And I bet, and it would probably play more like a human, and I wonder if it couldn't beat it.
Well, that makes sense, because AlphaZero playing against itself is not playing like a human, so it got the data from non-human games, whereas the chess.com stuff would be human games. And so
if it's going to play against itself, it's not necessarily, every one of those actual human games on chess.com was already being done by a supercomputer. Every single one was a supercomputer run, because that's what our brains are, right? So, and thinking deeply in terms of how chess is abstracted in the brain. And so instead of learning just based on raw garbage of what works and what doesn't work, it might be learning more book chess, or more like it would learn out of the collective wisdom of mankind instead of just learning out of just raw data. And because these, artificial neural network, once you train it, if you start it all at slightly different variables, you can train it and it'll get trained in a different way. It'll find different saddle points. And sometimes. So what I would be very interested to see somebody try and do that with chess.com. And I would, if chess.com isn't already trying to do that, then they need to be, and because they've got the tools, they got it all, they've memorized all that stuff. I used to play in there a long time ago, and they would do we were playing a traditional chess game, they would have like a recommendation for your move, but instead of the recommendation being coming from an AI, it would be coming from, these are all of the 5,000 games that have all traversed exactly as your game currently has, and in 60% of the games this guy moved here, they won. So they could query the database and give you hints and stuff like that. And that was one of the reasons why I used to play Bobby Fischer chess instead of classic chess when I was on. You know what that is?
No, I don't. Is that when the chess pieces start out in a random position?
Yeah.
Okay, then I do.
Not totally random. It was Bobby Fischer came up with it, and he was like, all right, well, there's certain premises that you need to have. You want to have your rooks have to be outside your king and your queen. And you got to have a black bishop and a white bishop. You can't have two black bishops, right? And other than that, it's randomized. And so there's like a certain order that you roll a die and you could put it down there. You figure it all out. And so you've got a rank of pawns, and then your back stuff is all garbled in some way. And they call it 960 because there's the way he came up with it. There was 960 total possible moves, or total possible arrangements. And then both sides line up the same way. You do all the white pieces and you just mirror the black pieces. So nobody has an intrinsic advantage because they got lined up. And they called it Bobby Fischer random chess for like years. And I think the chess groups decided to abandon his name because it had that stigma because he was like anti-Semitic or something. I don't know. It was something like that.
Oh, it would have definitely been his anti-Semitism. He was pretty anti-Semitic toward the end of his life.
And he was also, he was a conspiracy theorist and stuff like that. And which is a kind of thing that a lot of time crops up in really smart people. They start seeing patterns and stuff that may not be there, which is weird. That's a little bit scary when I'm running down this rabbit hole trying to figure out the culture war. Am I seeing patterns that aren't there?
Yeah, but then again, it can. I think in many cases, if you're really seeing patterns that aren't there, I think are worse for conspiracy theories, because people are trying to connect dots in social behaviors, basically, and there can be a lot of interpersonal bias that comes into that. Whereas trying to think, like looking at ant systems and comparing it to human systems and seeing looking at them as basically as mathematical systems that are maybe nearly identical in some ways, isn't so much, I think, seeing patterns that aren't there. I think in some ways that's sort of like a matter of computing E equals MC squared with metric data as opposed to standard English system data in terms of how you do the measurements. It doesn't really change the result. It's just how you represent it. And so,
maybe that's the problem with
well, and then you look at like the idea of memetics versus genetics. It's taking the mathematical system of natural selection and applying it to ideas. And there's a significant amount of content where that seems to be how it works.
I think so, but again, just because it seems to be how it works doesn't necessarily make it true. Like I have theories. I think
Right.
they're interesting theories that I have, but I mean, everything's, if it's not falsifiable, it's not a scientific statement. And, to falsify some of this stuff would take a tremendous effort, right? I mean, everybody's talking on the internet and nobody's taking the time to do a rigorous scientific study to falsify their own. So what we have instead is we have a whole bunch of just competing theories about how things work. And that's curious, but it's still only, it's still only useful in the first phase of science, right? I mean, and then, you have the other competing problem of you think you run into something that's profound. And, well, this is something I was thinking about recently. One of the more recent articles I wrote, this Facebook is Shiri's Scissor, talking about how social media interactions and whatnot are, the way the system is set up, it's set up to generate the most controversial statements it can. It's like, it works like an artificial neural network to generate controversial statements because that's what gets shared. And when it gets shared, that, the people writing a statement make more money because they're making money by the click. And it's a long and involved thing, but what struck me as interesting about this was that it was like, by the time I got this article written, I couldn't tell whether it was crazy or profound or banal. Like, and if I carried this article to the Slate Star critics, people, and they're like, duh. Of course, Facebook is tailor-made to create free category and social media. And then, if you carry it to my Facebook friends, they're going to tell me I'm crazy. And there's some boundary in there that are going to, people who could believe it and would understand it, but haven't thought about it, and they're going to think it's profound. And so as a writer, what you're trying to do kind of in some ways is any given idea, any given statement lives somewhere on this line graph, this spectrum between crazy and banal. Things are obvious. Crazy things are things that nobody's ever going to believe. And where those blend in the middle is there's the statements that are profound, right? And what's the width of that band on that scale? And a good writer needs to be able to slap an article right in that spot. That's the sweet spot. And the sweet spot changes by your target audience too, right?
Right. If I'm interested in making money, I need to write something that's maybe something a Democrat would like to read if I'm doing it on Medium.
Oh, well, I mean, part of that has to do with, Medium's demographic is a whole bunch of Democrats. And also their editorial staff is, I'm surprised I am infinitely blessed that they featured one of my articles.
Right.
The Prepper article didn't feature any of the other ones, but I figured they'd feature none. So I
Yeah.
got one more than I thought I'd get.
Well, the one of mine that got featured, because I've been lucky to have gotten that as well, is just like a textbook thing they'd want to see. It's called "Here's How We're Going to Pay For It." It talks about how to pay for universal health care, public college, infrastructure packages, and it just gives the data on how it's funded in Scandinavian countries. Right? That's like totally what they'd want to do.
Yeah.
That's totally the thing they'd want to feature.
That'll get featured. And then if you start figuring out, like, trying to model social justice as a religion, that'll get you blackballed. Right? So it all kind of, they've got their ideological bias. It's funny to me that they haven't, that businesses are taking this choice to pick an ideological side in these things, because what you have kind of is like Medium in how this is not necessarily, like, if Medium had gone completely to the right instead of completely to the left, they would have made the same mistake. What you do when you do that is you create a market space for a competing product that is just like you, except, meeting of a demographic. It just seems like poor business to me to not go ahead and try and meet both demographics.
Yeah, that's what I think. I'm at least happy that Medium, while they definitely are giving their nudges to things that lean left, you can write something more conservative, and they'll let it run. It's just you'll have to get your own following. That's for you to figure out.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, anybody can publish there. I mean, Breitbart could be publishing there in a different name, and he could get plenty of clicks as long as he had some other way to drive traffic other than getting featured by Medium, right? That's. But there's not a lot of featured stuff that's anything that's outside the, whatever the current narrative is. So, who knows? It's nothing I'm going to complain about. I mean, I've actually made some money off Medium this year. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I only started writing this year, but yeah, I made a hell of a lot more money than I thought I would by now.
Yeah, I mean, I started in March, and it's kind of cool. I like it. I do it mostly if I get a thought stuck in my head, I gotta get it out. And
well, for me, the reason was I noticed Medium. I realized, I'll make a really long Facebook comment or a really long Reddit comment, and I just thought I spend so much time on some of these comments that I might as well put them on Medium and make $5 from it.
Sure. Well, and, the other thing is that in Reddit, it's not likely that people are going to read it, and in Facebook, nobody's going to read it.
Right, but on Medium, people are paying specifically to read that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So then they'll not only read it, but you'll get some of their money for it. So why not?
It's well, I started writing for a pretty similar reason, because it was, the sea of kind of garbage, statistical analysis articles on guns in March of 2018 was very high, because all these things come out after mass shooter events. And I just got it was so tedious trying to refute them I was like saving the argument in a Word file, and I would be like, actually, ... copy, paste, wall of text that nobody reads. And I was like, well, this is stupid. What I should do is just clean it up a little bit better, put it on a blog someplace, and then actually ... link. That was why I started doing it. And, when I got the first one up there, one day I got bored and I stuck the Medium link up in the libertarian subreddit, and it went crazy viral. It was like 30 cross posts to 30 other subreddits at the time, simply because that was the extremely hot topic. That was what everybody's arguing about on Facebook at the time, right? And that's what I noticed in my traffic. I've got some articles that I find that I believe are very important and very fundamental to some of the ways that I think, like that article about the ants. Nobody's read that damn article, because nobody's going to share it, because it's not useful in a culture war argument. But the article that says everybody's lying about the relationship between gun homicide and gun ownership, I think it's got 200,000 hits or something, maybe. So, because it's useful in the culture war argument. And then that's, and the other thing that it hits is this is something that Scott Alexander talked about in Slave Star Codex. He did a lot of traffic analysis, maybe in 2014, about all of his posts, because he tags different posts of different things like wellness or, effective altruism or these sorts of concepts. And then he has this one tag that he puts in some of his posts that's regret. And he tags that with anything that he realizes is controversial enough that he's going to regret writing it. And that's where all his traffic comes from, turns out, right? Is the controversial stuff. And when he did he wrote an article about that, looking at his own traffic. And what his theory was, and I think there's a lot of real juice to this. I've been really stuck on this recently, thinking about it. What he said was, the most traffic you can get is having an article that 50% of the people agree with and 50% of the people disagree with. And if their agreements and disagreements are stronger, you're going to get way more traffic. And this goes back to the whole, using it as Facebook arguments. This is especially true with culture war positions, which is then, all right, so now that we know that how the traffic is made, take a step sideways. What's Vox's goal? Their first and primary objective is to keep lights on, and the way they do that is with clicks. And the same thing for Alex Jones, Fox, and the New Yorker and New York Times. So, and the subscription model ones are a little bit different, but really not that much. So what you have is a situation where there could be a lot of very important things that we should be talking about, but if they aren't going to make anybody argue, then they don't make anybody any money to publish articles about them, right?
Right.
Instead, they write articles that are going to make people argue, and whatever they can do to try and find the boundary condition that's 50-50 and is contentious, that's the money. That's what's going to make them the most money. And so that's what the articles tend to be. And then what happens to our political casts is that they form around the hot button issues because of the traffic of those, right? And then we end up with this unusual scenario that in an ordinary system probably wouldn't erupt at all, where why on earth is our popular presidential vote within 2% red blue? Like, that doesn't make any sense that it would be that close. And it's trending closer and closer, right? Does that make sense?
Right, that makes sense.
And it's a reflection on what the media is doing, and the media is, and that's a reflection on the business model that was created by social media to make people freak out. Which is why I named the blog Hand Waving Freakoutery. Right.
It all makes sense.
That's what I've been hung up on recently, is that. And so, why is the culture war happening? It's happening because we've changed the way we talk.
All right. Well, you know what? That's very insightful, and I think we're coming up on the end of our time here. So why don't we just leave it off there? I do encourage you, BJ, to as you write more, if you think people in our intellectual dark web will like it, share it there. And if you don't, maybe I'll do it anyway on your behalf.
Well, I appreciate that. I might do that. I've been known to self-promote occasion on Reddit. I do it in Slate Star and times, that kind of thing. Kind of fell off of it a little bit, but yeah, I've been kind of in a drought. I've been, I've had ideas, and I just haven't had the time to nail them down, or by the time I get them nailed down, I decide not to publish them. That kind of thing. I don't know. I'm sure I'll write again. That seems to be the trend. This has been great. I like that we didn't really have a like an hour time limit on this one, because it allowed us to jump down some crazy rabbit holes.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, thanks for making the time. It's been a good 2 hours, and maybe we'll bring you back on someday. Okay.
Sounds good. Take care.
Take care, BJ.